autumn evening, and Leo had found himself wandering down a desolate road on the outskirts of town. The usual route home felt longer tonight, and as the clock ticked past midnight, an unsettling feeling hung in the air, like the very atmosphere was holding its breath. The streets were quiet, unusually so. Even the typical rustling of leaves in the wind seemed to have stopped. As he passed the outskirts of a dense forest, a faint light flickered in the distance. Leo, always the curious type, couldn't resist. He turned off the road and made his way towards it, stepping carefully over uneven ground. What he found at the end of his short journey would forever change his understanding of reality. At first, it appeared like any other old train station, the kind you might find abandoned for years, worn by time and neglect. However, this one was different. The station had an almost ethereal quality to it. The platform stretched endlessly under the pale glow of a dim, flickering street lamp. The building itself seemed both solid and transparent at the same time, like something from a dream. The old-fashioned sign, barely visible in the darkness, read, "Ravenshade Station." Leo frowned. He had lived in this area all his life and had never seen or heard of a Ravenshade station. In fact, he had never even heard of any train stations along this road. His breath caught as he tried to wrap his mind around this strange place. He stepped closer to the platform, his footsteps silent on the cobblestone. A soft breeze stirred the air, carrying the smell of old wood and damp earth. The wind had a cold bite, but it wasn't enough to mask the odd heaviness that seemed to hang around the station. Suddenly, he heard the unmistakable sound of a train's horn in the distance. His heart raced as he turned towards the tracks. The eerie fog that had rolled in during the last few minutes seemed to thicken around the rails, distorting the world before him. A dark silhouette appeared, gradually becoming clearer. A train was coming, but this wasn't like any train Leo had ever seen. The train wasn't illuminated with the usual bright, cheerful lights of a modern commuter train. Instead, it was covered in deep shadows, the windows barely visible, dark like endless voids. As it drew closer, Leo's pulse quickened. The train screeched to a halt in front of him with an unnerving finality. It was silent in the moment after it stopped, but Leo could feel the weight of something heavy, like a presence was standing just beyond his vision. He stood frozen, unsure whether to run or stay. The door to the nearest carriage creaked open, revealing the faintest outline of a figure inside, standing motionless. Leo's breath caught. The figure was vague, a shadow that seemed to flicker with an unsettling aura. A voice, cold and distant, came from behind him, pulling him from his daze. "Are you coming?" Leo turned abruptly, but saw no one. The voice had seemed to come from the very air around him. As if in response, the door to the train swung open wider, and a pale, bony hand reached out from the shadowed interior. Something inside Leo stirred. A mix of dread and fascination overwhelmed him. This was no ordinary train, and certainly no ordinary night. He had the feeling that whatever this train was, wherever it had come from, it was not meant for the living. He took a hesitant step toward the train, drawn to it despite the sharp warning in the back of his mind. Another step and then another, but before he could take another, a cold gust of wind swept through the station, and the shadows seemed to deepen. A sudden movement caught his eye, and Leo's heart skipped a beat. Standing at the far end of the platform were several figures, tall and gaunt, their forms barely visible in the mist. They moved like they were walking against an invisible current, their clothes tattered and faces obscured by dark hoods. As they drew nearer, Leo could hear their whispers, but the words were garbled and strange, like they were speaking in a language he could not understand. His instincts screamed at him to turn and run, but his body refused to obey. The figure stopped just a few feet from him, standing silently. The air around him grew colder, and the station, once so still, began to hum with a faint, eerie sound, like a melody that was both beautiful and terrifying at the same time. A soft, echoing voice rang out, this time from the direction of the train. "Will you board?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Leo felt as though the station itself was waiting for his response. But something else had begun to stir in his mind, a realization that he was in far deeper than he had ever imagined. This was no ordinary train station. These were no ordinary passengers. And whatever fate awaited him on the train, it was not something he could easily walk away from. Before he could even begin to process the consequences of his next move, a loud, jarring sound filled the air, the screech of metal on metal. The train's door slammed shut with an ear-splitting bang, and the shadows of the figures that had been standing just moments before seemed to converge on him. They were close now, too close. Leo's body froze, his heart thudding in his chest. And then, in the most chilling whisper, the voice came again. Too late. With a sudden, terrifying force, the ground beneath him seemed to shift. The station, the train, and the strange figures all began to fade away, like a nightmare slipping through his fingers. Leo blinked, trying to make sense of what was happening. But when he opened his eyes again, he found himself standing alone in the middle of the road, miles away from the station. His breath came in shallow gasps as he looked around. The familiar scenery of the town stretched before him, but there was no sign of the station, no trace of the train. Had it all been a dream, a hallucination, or had something far darker called him to Ravenshade Station? The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as he turned and began walking toward home. But something gnawed at him. He could still hear the soft whispers, echoing in his mind. And then, just before he reached his front door, a faint sound reached his ears. The unmistakable sound of a train whistle. It was close. Leo had barely slept that night. His mind, plagued by what he had experienced at Ravenshade Station, refused to quiet down. The sounds of the train whistle echoed in his thoughts, sharp and cold, like the cry of a dying animal in the distance. Each time he closed his eyes, he could see the faint glow of the station in the distance, the ghostly figures waiting silently at the platform, their hoods shrouding their faces. The image refused to leave him. By the time the morning light filtered through his bedroom window, Leo had made a decision. He had to go back to Ravenshade Station. He couldn't explain why, but he felt a strange pull, as if the very fabric of reality was beginning to unravel. The whispers, the presence of the passengers, it was all too real to ignore. He had to know what was happening, even if it meant facing something he wasn't ready for. As he stood in front of his bathroom mirror, splashing cold water on his face, Leo wondered what he was walking into. Ravenshade wasn't just some forgotten station in the woods. It was something more. But what? The day passed slowly. Every glance out the window seemed to be followed by the lingering thought that the station was waiting for him, hidden just out of view. He tried to shake the sensation, but it clung to him like a shadow. When night finally fell, Leo couldn't ignore it any longer. He grabbed his jacket, took a deep breath, and stepped outside. His heart raced in his chest, each beat reverberating through his body. He knew he was walking towards something, but what that something was, he couldn't say. The walk was longer this time, as if the road itself stretched on forever. The wind whispered through the trees, bending the branches as if they were trying to tell him something. His footsteps crunched against the gravel road, the sound too loud in the quiet of the night. When he finally reached the clearing where Ravenshade Station had been, his breath caught in his throat. The station was there, but this time it was different. The The station stood in stark contrast to the last time Leo had seen it. The flickering light now pulsed like a heartbeat, casting an eerie glow that lit up the surrounding fog. The platform was empty, but the station itself seemed alive. Leo's instincts screamed at him to turn back, to run far away, but something held him there. As he stepped forward, the whistle of the train sounded again, louder this time, piercing the silence of the night. It was as if the train itself was calling to him, summoning him to step aboard. Leo hesitated, looking around. There was no sign of the train yet, only the sound, echoing from all directions, until it seemed to fill his mind. He had no choice but to approach the platform. His feet moved forward without his conscious decision, as if guided by something else. And as he drew closer, he could make out the faint outline of the train in the distance, creeping slowly toward the station. It looked almost the same as before, dark, distorted, as if it were a part of the night itself. The train's headlights sliced through the fog, casting long shadows over the tracks. But now, Leo noticed something strange. The passengers, those same eerie, hooded figures from the night before, were standing at the edges of the platform, just out of reach. They weren't moving, but there was a palpable energy between them and the train, an invisible force pulling them closer, binding them together. Leo's heart pounded in his chest as he walked closer, the tension in the air thick enough to choke. As he reached the edge of the platform, the first figure stepped forward. It was tall, too tall, and its movements were jerky, unnatural, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. The figure didn't speak, but its presence alone seemed to demand attention. Without thinking, Leo stepped back, his foot catching on the edge of the platform. He stumbled, but the figure didn't seem to notice. It simply stood there, unmoving, its head tilted slightly as if observing him. The sound of the train grew louder, and Leo felt the ground tremble beneath him. It wasn't just the noise of the train approaching. It was the sheer weight of something ancient, something powerful closing in. He could feel it in his bones. The train came into view then, its massive form sliding along the tracks like a beast stalking its prey. Leo's breath caught in his throat as he saw the door to one of the carriages swing open, the cold wind rushing out in a gust that made his hair stand on end. Inside, the shadows writhed, and for a moment, Leo thought he saw faces, hundreds of pale faces staring back at him, eyes wide with fear or hunger. He couldn't tell. Before he could make sense of it, the figure that had been standing at the edge of the platform moved. It was fast, too fast, almost like it was gliding across the ground. It reached the open door of the train, its bony hand gripping the edge, and turned to face Leo. Its voice was cold, harsh, and echoing, like it came from far away. "Come with us." The words sent a shiver through Leo's spine. He wanted to run, wanted to turn and leave this place behind, but his feet felt as though they were rooted to the ground. The figure stepped aside, revealing the dark interior of the train. For a moment, Leo stood frozen, staring at the door. His mind raced, thoughts crashing together. He didn't want to go. He didn't want to face whatever horrors waited inside that train. But something deep inside him, some primal instinct, told him that this was the only way to understand what was happening. He had to board the train. He had to know. Slowly, Leo stepped forward, the cold air biting at his skin as he approached the door. The figure did not move, its hollow eyes following him as he crossed the threshold. The door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang. The air inside the train was thick, suffocating. It smelled of dust and decay, as if the train had been sitting in the darkness for a century. Leo's pulse quickened as he moved down the narrow, dimly lit corridor. The sound of his footsteps echoed eerily in the silence. The passengers sat in the seats, but they were not the same as before. Their faces were twisted, distorted, their eyes black voids that seemed to devour the light. They whispered to each other, their voices low and unintelligible, but when they noticed Leo, all the whispers stopped. The train jolted, and Leo was thrown against the nearest seat. He caught himself, his heart hammering in his chest. Something was wrong. Everything about this train, about these passengers, screamed danger. He tried to move toward the door, but his body refused to obey. He was trapped. And then, the train began to move. The train's motion was smooth at first, almost gentle. But as the wheels turned against the track, a growing sense of unease settled over Leo. His body remained tense, his hands trembling slightly as he pressed them to his sides, desperately trying to regain control over himself. But it was impossible. Every passing moment in this strange train, filled with its ominous passengers, felt like a step deeper into an abyss he wasn't sure he could escape from. The train was silent except for the occasional creaks and the rhythmic thrum of its movement. Yet, there was something else beneath the sound, an almost imperceptible hum that seemed to vibrate through Leo's bones. The air was stale, thick with an oppressive heaviness that made it hard to breathe. Each breath felt shallow, as if the atmosphere itself was pushing against him. Leo's eyes darted around the narrow corridor, his heart pounding in his chest. The passengers, those unnerving, faceless figures, remained perfectly still in their seats, their heads turned toward him like they were waiting for something. Their hollow, soulless eyes seemed to track every movement he made. There was something about their gaze that sent chills crawling up his spine, something that felt older than time itself, something that gnawed at the edges of his sanity. He took a hesitant step toward the nearest seat, hoping to sit and calm his nerves. But as soon as his foot landed on the floor, the train jolted again, more violently this time, throwing him off balance. His knees buckled, and he fell hard to the floor. The floor was cold, unyielding like stone. He winced but pushed himself up quickly, not wanting to seem weak in front of the silent passengers. As he stood shakily, the figure closest to him shifted. For a moment, Leo froze, his body stiffening in fear. The figure, whose face remained hidden under a dark hood, moved its arm slowly, and then it pointed directly at him. Leo's stomach lurched. He instinctively backed away, but his foot caught on the edge of a seat, causing him to stumble. His hands shot out to grab hold of the nearest support, which happened to be the cold, metallic frame of the train window. It was only then that Leo realized something was horribly wrong. The window wasn't a window at all. It was a mirror. As he gazed into the glass, he saw his reflection, but it was twisted, distorted, as though something else was looking back at him. A dark figure, shrouded in shadow, stood behind him in the reflection, its face completely obscured. Leo's breath hitched in his throat. He whipped around, but there was nothing there. The mirror had shown him something that couldn't be real. He shook his head, willing himself to stay calm, but the air inside the train grew heavier, pressing down on him like the weight of the world itself. A voice echoed from the other side of the train, low and raspy, like it came from deep within the earth. It wasn't loud, but it was impossible to ignore. "You should have stayed away." Leo's heart skipped a beat. He spun around, trying to locate the source of the voice, but the passengers remained still, their faces unreadable under their hoods. He couldn't tell if the voice had come from one of them or if it was simply a figment of his imagination. "Who said that?" Leo called out, his voice shaky, yet trying to sound confident. There was no answer, only the constant hum of the train and the sound of his own breath in the stillness. Another jolt rocked the train, throwing Leo off balance once again. This time, he lost his footing completely, crashing into one of the seats. He groaned as he scrambled to get up, the cold metal of the seat digging into his side. The train seemed to be picking up speed, its motion becoming more erratic, the rails screeching beneath it. His pulse raced as the lights inside the train flickered, casting the interior in a strobe-like effect. Shadows seemed to dance across the walls, bending and shifting with every pulse of light. Leo could hear whispers now, low, guttural murmurs that seemed to come from every direction. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, murmuring dark secrets that Leo couldn't begin to comprehend. The train began to slow, the screeching of the rails almost deafening. Leo stumbled forward, bracing himself against the wall. His heart was pounding in his chest, and the fear was almost overwhelming. The lights flickered once again, casting a sickly yellow hue over everything. "Where are we going?" Leo asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure who had pointed at him earlier shifted again, its hooded face tilting slightly, as if in curiosity. The shadowy figure remained motionless, watching him with an intensity that made Leo's blood run cold. And then, without warning, the door to one of the carriages at the end of the train slid open with a soft hiss. Leo froze, his breath catching in his throat. He didn't know what lay beyond that door, but his instincts screamed at him to avoid it, to stay away from whatever was waiting for him in the darkness. But curiosity, damnable, relentless curiosity, drove him forward. The moment the door opened, the air in the train grew colder, as if a chilling wind was blowing through it. Leo hesitated only for a second before taking a step toward the open door. His hand gripped the metal frame, cold and unfeeling, and he peered inside. What he saw made his blood run cold. The next compartment was unlike anything he had seen before. The walls were made of a dark, smooth material that shimmered unnaturally. The lights flickered, casting strange shadows across the floor, where the figure of a child, pale and fragile, stood alone, staring at him with wide, glassy eyes. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Instead, Leo felt the words in his mind, cold and disembodied. "Do not come closer." Leo's body went stiff, and his breath caught in his throat. There was something about her presence, something ancient and terrifying, that sent waves of panic coursing through him. But before he could react, the child slowly turned, her movement jerky and unnatural, and began to walk away from him, deeper into the compartment. The door slammed shut behind her. Leo took a step back, his heart hammering in his chest. The whispers grew louder now, filling his ears with unintelligible murmurs. The train was no longer just a train. It was a vessel for something far darker, something that had been waiting for him. And now there was no turning back. Leo's heart pounded in his chest, louder than the train's relentless hum. He stood frozen in place, the cold air pressing down on him from all sides, suffocating him. The image of the child, her pale face and hollow eyes, was burned into his mind. He couldn't understand what was happening, nor could he escape the feeling that whatever he was experiencing was far beyond his understanding. Ravenshade Station was not just a place, it was a trap. The train moved at an increasing speed, its wheels screeching along the tracks with an eerie, unnatural rhythm. The doors slammed shut with a heavy metallic thud, the noise reverberating through the train car. Leo took a deep breath, but it did nothing to calm the pounding in his chest. His eyes darted around the compartment, searching for an escape, some way out of this nightmare. But there was no escape. The whispers, once barely audible, were now deafening. They filled the air, twisting around him like a cloud of shadows, whispering secrets he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. The words came in a language he didn't recognize, yet they felt all too familiar, like memories he had long buried, memories that didn't belong to him. A sudden jolt from the train nearly knocked him to the ground again. Leo steadied himself, gripping the edge of a seat to keep from falling. The train had slowed down, but the atmosphere inside had become thicker, heavier, as if something was suffocating the very air itself. It felt like the walls of the train were closing in on him, and no matter how much he tried to breathe, he felt as if the oxygen was being drained from his lungs. Leo's eyes lingered on the door that had opened earlier, the one with the strange child inside. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was calling him, pulling him toward it. He didn't want to go, not after what he had seen, but his feet moved on their own accord, drawn to the door with an irresistible force. His hand trembled as he reached out to touch the cold handle of the door. The whispers grew louder, louder than ever before, their voices becoming frantic, desperate, like the cries of the damned. Leo hesitated for a moment, but then the door creaked open by itself, as though it had been waiting for him. The compartment beyond the door was no longer the same as before. The strange, shimmering walls had turned into a warped reflection of reality. The floor was covered in thick, dark smoke that rose from the cracks in the ground, swirling around his feet like a living thing. The walls seemed to pulse and breathe, expanding and contracting as if the very train itself was alive. The child stood at the far end of the compartment, her back to Leo, her head tilted to one side, and her body moved in jerky, unnatural motions. Leo's skin crawled as he stepped forward, every instinct in his body screaming at him to run, to leave this place and never return. But he couldn't stop himself. His feet carried him toward the child, step by slow step. The air in the compartment was thick with a foul, rotten stench, like decaying flesh. Leo could feel it crawling into his nose, choking him, but he pushed forward, unable to resist the pull. He had to know what was behind all of this. He had to understand. As he reached the child, she turned suddenly, her pale, emotionless face staring up at him. Her mouth opened, and for a brief moment, Leo thought she was going to speak. But instead, a horrific scream erupted from her throat, a sound so inhuman, so shrill, that it nearly shattered his eardrums. The scream echoed through the train, reverberating off the walls, and Leo staggered back, his hands pressed to his ears in a desperate attempt to block out the noise. The child's eyes were wide and blank, like hollow sockets. There was no soul behind them, no emotion, just a dark, endless void. And then, something worse happened. The child's body twisted unnaturally, her arms and legs elongating, stretching in ways that should not have been possible. Her face contorted into a grotesque, gaping mouth filled with rows of sharp, jagged teeth, her head tilting back until it nearly broke at the neck. Leo's breath caught in his throat as he took a step back, his mind racing for an explanation. This wasn't real, couldn't be real, but the child, or whatever she had become, was standing right in front of him, her distorted form blocking his only way out of the compartment. The train suddenly lurched, the floor beneath Leo's feet shifting violently, and for a split second, the compartment seemed to dissolve into nothingness. The walls, the child, everything vanished, leaving Leo standing alone in a vast emptiness. The silence was deafening. Leo spun around, his heart hammering in his chest. He was back in the main compartment of the train, standing in the exact spot he had been earlier. But everything had changed. The train was no longer moving, the hum of the tracks silent. The passengers, those faceless, emotionless figures, were still seated, but now, their heads were turned toward him, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. They were watching him. Suddenly, the air shifted. The door at the end of the train opened again. But this time, it wasn't just the child waiting inside. There were others, figures, shadows, their forms indistinct and twisted. They stepped forward into the train, one by one, their footsteps silent, their faces hidden beneath hoods. Leo couldn't see their eyes, but he could feel them, the weight of their gaze heavy on his soul. He tried to move, but his feet were frozen to the floor. A deep, guttural voice echoed from the back of the train, a voice that seemed to come from all directions at once. "Welcome to the end." Before Leo could react, a pair of hands shot out from the shadows, gripping his arms with unyielding force. He struggled, but they were too strong, pulling him forward toward the door that had just opened. He tried to scream, to fight back, but the hands tightened, dragging him toward the darkness beyond the door. Leo's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Where was he? Why was this happening? And what did it all mean? But there were no answers, only the pull of the darkness. Leo's body jerked violently, as if waking from a terrible dream. His eyes flew open, but it took a moment for him to realize he wasn't in the train anymore. The world around him was dark, suffocating, and cold. His heart thudded against his chest, the sound thumping in his ears as he tried to make sense of his surroundings. The train had vanished. The eerie train compartment, the unnerving passengers, and even the child had all disappeared. Now, Leo found himself standing in a completely unfamiliar place. A vast, dark expanse, like a cavern or an underground temple. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, and the distant echoes of something scraping against stone reverberated through the cavern's walls. His feet felt cold, as though they were sinking into the ground. Leo looked down, but he couldn't see his legs, just endless shadows. The feeling of being watched returned, and he instinctively spun around, his breath quickening. It was impossible to tell where he was, but something told him he was not alone. A figure stepped out of the darkness. Leo's pulse quickened as he took a step back. He couldn't make out the face at first, just a silhouette, tall and foreboding, draped in a tattered cloak that billowed in the still air. The figure's head was slightly bowed, as if lost in thought, its presence commanding but somehow distant. The figure stood perfectly still, its movements slow and deliberate, as if waiting for something or someone. "Who are you?" Leo asked, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to sound firm. The figure raised its head, revealing nothing but an empty, black void where a face should have been. A hollow, inhuman darkness stared back at him, sending an involuntary chill down Leo's spine. "I am the one who watches," the figure's voice boomed, deep and resonant. It echoed off the cavern's walls, distorting into a cacophony that felt as if it were coming from every direction at once. "I am the gatekeeper." Leo's mind raced. This place, this being, he had seen something like it before, or had he? The memory was faint, clouded, but he knew that it was crucial. The answers he sought were locked somewhere in his past, but he couldn't grasp them. He had to press on. "What is this place? What do you want from me?" Leo demanded, his voice shaking with the weight of fear. "The question is not what I want from you, but what you seek," the figure replied cryptically. "You came to the train station and you called for the truth. But truth comes with a price, Leo. And now you must choose." Leo's breath caught in his throat. This was it, the moment he'd been dreading. The moment when everything changed. There was no turning back now. "What price?" Leo whispered, the cold air biting at his skin. The shadows around him seemed to grow darker, thicker, as if the very air were alive, pressing in on him. The figure took a step forward, and as it moved, the shadows parted, revealing a pair of ancient stone doors behind it. The doors were inscribed with strange symbols, twisting patterns that seemed to shift as Leo stared at them. His gaze was drawn to the intricate designs, and he could feel his pulse quicken again. Something about the symbols felt familiar, almost as if they were calling to him. "You will soon understand," the gatekeeper said. "But first you must enter." Leo swallowed hard. This was not a choice. It was an ultimatum. He had no idea what awaited him behind those doors, but the gatekeeper's words were clear. He had no other option. With a steadying breath, Leo nodded, feeling a sense of resolve settle over him. He was in too deep now. He had to face whatever this place had to offer, no matter how terrifying it might be. Slowly, he moved toward the stone doors, each step sending a shiver down his spine. As his hand reached out to touch the cold, smooth surface of the door, a sudden noise rang out from the darkness. A soft, childlike giggle. It echoed through the cavern like a distant memory, sending a jolt of fear through Leo's body. He turned sharply, but there was no one there. Just the void, the shadows, and the oppressive silence. The gatekeeper did not speak again. He simply watched as Leo opened the door. He hesitated for a moment, then, with a deep breath, pushed the heavy stone aside. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow, dimly lit hallway. The air smelled of mildew and decay, and the walls seemed to shift and pulse, as if the very stone was alive. A feeling of dread washed over Leo, and his heart began to race again. Whatever lay at the end of this hallway was worse than anything he could imagine. He stepped through the threshold, and the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang. Leo froze, his heart thundering in his chest as he realized there was no turning back. The hallway stretched on ahead, endless and winding. The floor beneath his feet felt uneven, and the walls seemed to close in with each step he took, as though the space itself were trying to suffocate him. The only light came from dim, flickering torches mounted on the walls, their flames casting long, distorted shadows across the corridor. As Leo walked, the air grew heavier, the temperature colder. His breath came in shallow gasps, visible in the frigid air. It felt as if something was following him. An unseen presence, always just out of his reach, but never far enough to ignore. Every few steps, the sound of something scraping across the floor echoed faintly from behind him, as though 1,000 unseen feet were trailing him through the darkness. His mind screamed at him to turn around, to escape, but something inside him refused to stop. The darkness ahead was irresistible, pulling him forward, deeper into the unknown. And then, without warning, the hallway opened up into a massive chamber. Leo's eyes widened as he took in the vast expanse. The room was cavernous, filled with rows upon rows of what appeared to be wooden crates. But they weren't just any crates. They were old, ancient even, covered in dust and cobwebs. The wood was warped, cracked, as if it had been here for centuries. As he ventured deeper into the chamber, his breath hitched. From the shadows, figures began to emerge, moving silently between the crates. Leo's pulse raced as he watched them. Tall, shadowy figures, their faces obscured by hoods. They glided across the floor without a sound, their footsteps eerily quiet. One of them turned toward him, its hooded face raising just enough for Leo to see a glimpse of its eyes, glowing yellow and filled with an unnerving sense of malice. The figure stepped closer, its hand reaching out as if to beckon him forward. Leo stepped back, the cold sweat dripping down his neck. He could feel the eyes of the others on him, even though they hadn't moved. The air grew thick, stifling, and for a moment he felt as though he couldn't breathe. "Welcome to the real Raven Shade," the figure whispered in a voice that echoed in his ears. "This is where your journey truly begins." Leo's mind raced as he faced the towering, monstrous figure that had emerged from the toppled crates. The creature was unlike anything he had ever seen, its body twisted and malformed, like a grotesque version of something once human. Its limbs stretched unnaturally long, its skin a sickly shade of pale gray. Eyes, black and gleaming like pools of ink, stared at Leo with a malevolent hunger. The air around him grew colder as the figure loomed closer. The walls of the cavern seemed to close in around him, suffocating the very breath from his lungs. Leo's heart pounded in his chest, his palms slick with sweat. He had no weapons, no escape, just the overwhelming sense that he had wandered into something far beyond his understanding. The creature's mouth parted with a grotesque snarl, revealing rows of jagged, razor-sharp teeth. It moved forward with a slow, deliberate pace, its hands dragging along the floor, leaving deep grooves in the stone as it advanced. "Leo," the voice came, a guttural, distorted whisper that seemed to emanate from the very shadows themselves. "You should have never come here." Leo stumbled backward, his legs unsteady beneath him. He didn't know how he could fight this thing, how he could possibly survive. But one thing was certain: the creature meant to destroy him. In a panic, Leo turned to face the hooded figures who had emerged from the darkness. They were now surrounding him, their glowing eyes fixed on him as they stepped closer, their movements synchronized and eerily calm. Leo's breath came in ragged gasps as he realized that there was no way out. The walls were closing in, and the creature was drawing near. Suddenly, a voice rang out from behind the hooded figures. It was familiar, soft, childlike, but with an edge of fear. Leo turned toward the sound, his heart skipping a beat. From the shadows, a small figure appeared. It was the child, the one he had seen on the train. But now, the child looked different. There was a dark energy around her, something malevolent that seemed to radiate from her like a curse. Her eyes gleamed with an unnatural light, and her face was contorted into a twisted smile. "You're not alone, Leo," the child whispered, her voice tinged with mockery. "They've been waiting for you." Leo's stomach churned. The child's words sent a shiver of dread through him. They'd been waiting for him. But for what? Before he could react, the creature lunged forward with terrifying speed. Its claws slashed through the air, grazing Leo's arm. Pain shot through him like electricity, but he didn't have time to think. He had to move. Leo sprinted down the corridor, his legs pumping with fear. He could hear the creature's heavy footsteps pounding behind him, the sound growing louder with every passing second. The cavern seemed to stretch endlessly, the walls shifting and warping as if the space itself was alive, bending to the will of whatever dark force controlled it. The hallway twisted and turned, and Leo had no idea which direction he was heading. All he knew was that the creature was still after him, and the hooded figures were closing in from behind. The dim light of the flickering torches cast long, grotesque shadows that seemed to reach for him, as though the very darkness was trying to swallow him whole. In the distance, Leo could see a faint light, a flicker of hope, a doorway. He had no idea what lay beyond it, but he had no choice. He had to reach it. As he ran toward the light, a strange sensation washed over him. A feeling that the walls were shifting, that reality itself was distorting. His footsteps felt slower, as if the world around him was dragging him back, pulling him into the darkness. He fought against it, pushing forward with all his strength. The creature was still pursuing him, its growls growing louder, its claws scraping against the stone floor. Leo's heart hammered in his chest. He couldn't outrun it forever. He had to find a way to escape. He reached the doorway, his hand outstretched to touch the cold, iron door handle. As his fingers brushed the surface, a surge of energy shot through him, knocking him backward. The air around him crackled with an intense power, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Leo's breath caught in his throat as he looked around. The hallway, the creature, the hooded figures, they were all gone. The cavern was empty, silent. The only sound was his own ragged breathing. Confused and disoriented, Leo stood up, his legs weak beneath him. He had no idea what had just happened. Had it all been a nightmare? Was he still dreaming? But as he looked around, a cold realization washed over him. The train station, the people, the creatures, everything was real. And if he didn't find a way to stop it, he would become part of this world forever. He stepped forward, toward the now open door. The light beyond was blinding, but it was the only way out. He had no choice but to face whatever waited for him on the other side. But as he crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind him, and the darkness swallowed him whole. When Leo woke, the world around him was eerily quiet. He was no longer in the cavern or the twisted hallway. He was lying on cold stone tiles, with only faint, flickering light to guide him. The smell of must and decay filled the air, and the atmosphere felt thick, as though something oppressive was pressing down on him. Groaning, Leo slowly sat up, wiping the sweat from his brow. His body ached, and his mind was racing with confusion. He tried to make sense of where he was. Was this another part of the abandoned station? Was this a new nightmare? Or was it something far worse? As he struggled to stand, the faint light grew stronger. It came from an old, rusted lantern hanging from the wall, casting long shadows across the stone floor. The walls were lined with strange symbols, carved into the surface, glowing faintly as if pulsing with an unnatural energy. Leo shuddered, feeling the weight of the place settle around him. It was as if the building itself was alive, breathing, watching. He glanced around, but the only thing he could see was an eerie, empty corridor stretching out in front of him. Taking a deep breath, Leo stepped forward, the clink of his footsteps echoing in the silence. Each step felt like it carried him deeper into the unknown, into a place where the line between reality and nightmare had blurred beyond recognition. The train station was still there, but it was no longer the same. The platform was darker, the shadows more ominous. The once abandoned trains now seemed to pulse with a dark energy, their doors open like gaping mouths, waiting to devour anyone foolish enough to board. Leo didn't know what to expect or what dangers lay in wait. But one thing was certain: the station, the passengers, the dark force lurking behind it all, they were connected. And if he didn't uncover the truth, he might never leave. As he wandered through the station, his thoughts returned to the child he had seen earlier, the one with the dark energy. He had to find her, had to understand her role in all of this. Leo's instincts told him she was key to unraveling the mystery, but there was something unsettling about her. She wasn't just a lost soul. There was something more sinister about her presence. He reached the end of the platform, and that's when he saw her again. The child was standing near an old ticket booth, her pale face illuminated by the lanterns around her. She wasn't smiling this time. Instead, her expression was cold, distant, as though she had become something more than human. "You shouldn't have come back," the child said, her voice almost a whisper. Her eyes glowed a sickly green, and Leo felt a chill creep up his spine as he looked at her. "Why?" Leo asked, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to sound strong. "What is this place? What's happening?" The child took a slow step forward, her gaze never leaving his. "This place, it feeds on the souls of the lost, the ones who wander in, like you." Leo's heart skipped a beat. "Souls of the lost," he repeated, confusion flooding his mind. "But I'm not lost. You think you're different?" she interrupted. "You're just like the rest. You've been marked. They've been waiting for you." Leo stepped back, his mind reeling. "Who has been waiting for me?" Before the child could respond, a loud noise echoed from behind him. He turned, eyes wide in fear. The train, it was moving again. The ancient locomotive, long abandoned, was slowly creeping toward him on the tracks. But this time there was something wrong with it. The windows were dark and strange. Ghostly figures stood in the shadows. Their faces were obscured, but Leo could feel their gaze on him. "Get away from the train," the child cried out suddenly, her voice desperate. "They'll take you." But it was too late. Leo felt himself drawn forward, his feet moving against his will. The train was close now, its massive wheels screeching as it came to a halt. The doors slid open, and he could hear the eerie sound of whispering voices from within. Without thinking, Leo stumbled forward, as though the train itself had a magnetic pull. The child screamed behind him, but he couldn't stop himself. Something inside him, something dark and primal, urged him toward the open door. As he stepped onto the train, a rush of cold air hit him. The train car was empty, save for the eerie shadows that moved along the walls. The seats were covered in thick layers of dust, and the faintest trace of a strange, sweet scent filled the air. But something wasn't right. The doors slammed shut behind him, trapping him inside. Leo spun around, his heart racing, but before he could react, the train lurched forward, speeding away down the tracks. Leo's breath quickened in the pitch-black darkness of the train, his senses overloaded with the unnatural whispers growing louder, mingling with the rumbling sounds of the train's motion. He couldn't see a thing, but the whispers seemed to come from all directions, no longer distant but closing in on him, each voice a cold, hollow echo, and every word more desperate than the last. "Get out of the train, before it's too late." The voice, distinct, clear, sounded like the child he had met earlier. It cut through the chaos, and for a moment, Leo tried to focus, to reach out, to find her once more. But the train sped up, faster and faster, as though the very ground beneath him was being ripped away. He stumbled, his heart thumping painfully in his chest. His hands reached out to steady himself against the cold metal walls of the train, but as he touched them, they felt wrong. The train wasn't just old and abandoned. It was alive, somehow, as though it fed off his fear. The walls pulsed with a dark energy, each heartbeat vibrating through his skin. And then, without warning, the train came to a sudden halt. The jerking motion threw Leo forward, his face hitting the cold floor as the lights flickered back to life, blinding him for a split second. When the blinding lights settled, Leo looked up and found himself standing in the middle of a station, an eerily familiar station. It was the same one he had seen earlier, the one that only appeared on certain nights. But this time, there was no mistaking it. It was a station for souls who had never truly left, passengers doomed to wander forever. A long line of shadowy figures stood along the platform, each one silent and still, their eyes hollow, their faces lost to time. The air was thick with an unbearable, suffocating sense of dread. Leo's stomach twisted with an all-consuming fear as he realized that they were waiting for something. A movement caught his eye, and there, standing near the station's ticket booth, was the child. Her eyes now glowed a sickly green, her presence no longer that of a lost soul but something far more sinister. "You shouldn't have come back," the child said, her voice carrying a strange weight that made Leo shiver. "What is this place?" Leo asked, his voice shaking despite his attempts to keep calm. "What do they want?" The child tilted her head, and her grin grew wider, showing teeth that were too sharp, too unnatural. "This station is the gateway for those who never found their peace," she said, her tone growing darker. "But they are waiting for you. You were always meant to come here, Leo." "No," he whispered, his mind racing to make sense of it all. I'm not one of them." The child's laughter echoed around him, cold and hollow. You never were, but now you are. Once you step off this platform, once you join us, there's no turning back. Before Leo could respond, the shadows that lined the station platform began to shift. They moved, twisting and contorting like living things, reaching out toward him with long, clawed hands. The passengers, the lost souls, began to stir, their hollow eyes focusing on him. Leo took a step back, but the darkness was closing in. The chilling whispers became louder, more urgent. They wanted him. They wanted him to join them in their eternal torment. No! Leo gasped, panic rising in his chest. He spun around, looking for any escape. But the train, the spectral train, was there again, its doors wide open, waiting. He could hear the sound of its whistle, haunting and foreboding. And just like before, he knew it wasn't just a train. It was a prison, a trap for souls like his, souls who had wandered too far, lost in the web of time and darkness. But Leo had to get off this station. He had to escape. With every ounce of strength, he ran, his legs moving faster than he had ever run before. He could hear the screeching of the train's wheels, the howling wind behind him, and the desperate cries of the souls as they reached out to him, trying to pull him into their eternal despair. His heart raced. He had no idea where the station ended, or if there was even an end at all. But the child's words haunted him. Once he stepped off this platform, he would be one of them. Leo glanced back only once, seeing the ghostly figures inching closer with every step. The train's doors were closing behind him, the dark figures ready to consume him. But as he reached the end of the platform, something else appeared. A light, a single light, soft and warm, appeared just ahead. It wasn't the dim, flickering lights of the station, but something more pure, something that cut through the shadows. Leo didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward it, his heart beating like a drum, his body begging for release. And then, as the darkness began to overtake him, Leo reached the light. The station began to fade, the chilling whispers dissolving into the air, the shadows retreating as the light enveloped him entirely. He stepped into the light, the world around him vanishing. When Leo opened his eyes again, he found himself standing on solid ground, back in the real world. The station, the train, the child, they were all gone. It was morning. The sun was shining, birds were chirping. He was standing in an empty field, far away from the train station he had just escaped. But as Leo stood there, trying to catch his breath, something dark lingered in his mind. In the distance, just beyond the horizon, Leo thought he saw the faint outline of a train, a spectral train, waiting for the next lost soul. And then, in the silence of the field, he heard a whisper. "You'll never be free.